Welcome to the Cashflow Academy podcast. I'm your host, Andy Tanner, and we've got a really important show today. Really fun guest. We have Brian Riedl today with us, and he has written a report that is, I'll put a link in the description to this so you can read it yourself. It's worth reading. And we're going to talk a lot about debt. We're going to talk about off-balance sheet liabilities. We're going to talk about promised money as well as borrowed money and how that's going to affect the coming generations and even this one. I think this is one of the topics I'm passionate about, so we'll discuss it. Before we hop in and have Brian introduce himself, just a reminder to like and subscribe to the podcast, and also make sure you pay a visit to yourinvestingclass.com. Yourinvestingclass.com's got great resources free, and you can pursue your financial education, learn more about what we do at the Cashflow Academy. With that, Brian, thanks for being on the program, and just a pleasure to meet you. I very much enjoyed reading your report and what you had to say. There's several reports I subscribe to: the Congressional Budget Office, the Treasury, the General Accountability Office. You've taken some of these numbers and made some really interesting observations I'll highlight. But before we get into the depth of that, tell us a little bit about yourself, Brian. What made you become interested in these ideas and in these important these important problems, and why the report?
Oh, thanks, Andy. Well, I've worked in Washington now as a budget geek for 24 years. It doesn't really feel like that long. I still feel like I'm out here on a work trip. Um, but I spent the first 10 years in Washington running budget policy at the Heritage Foundation. Then I spent 6 years on Capitol Hill as chief economist to Senator Rob Portman from Ohio and staff director within the Finance Committee subcommittee. And I've been at the Manhattan Institute for 6 years or 7 years. Additionally, I've done 4 presidential campaigns. I directed budget policy for the Romney campaign in 2012 and the Rubio campaign in 2016. The reason I got into this issue is, as an economist, the more that I learned, even in the late 90s, as an economist about policy, the more I saw that the long-term fiscal picture was really looking dire, particularly when the baby boomers retired about 20 years from that point. And I like numbers, I like economics, and I saw a crisis coming, and not a lot of people really focused on it. And there's still not a lot of people focused on it, so I dove in.
Fantastic stuff. So let's talk a little bit about this. I'm not an economist. I'm a investor, but I
Mhm.
care about economic data, obviously. And a lot of my students say, how do you predict the future? And I often say, well, perhaps the defining characteristic of markets is their unpredictability. It's really hard to see where they're coming. But if you'd like to
Mhm.
take a stab at it, there's 3 or 4 things we use to try to peek in the future. One of them is history often repeats itself. Another is you look at trend. If a football's been
Mhm.
thrown one way, it usually takes some time to turn about. But I would say one of the largest ones has to do with policy. And I have I don't know if it's an equation, but policy applied to demographics will give you future. And I think that might be where you land. Is that fair to say?
I mean, it's funny because when I talk about long-term deficits, people are like, well, you can't predict anything in 20 years. We don't know what's going to happen. Well, I can't tell you what the inflation rate is going to be in 20 years. I can't tell you what the unemployment rate is going to be in 20 years. But I can tell you that 74 million baby boomers have already retired, and that they get a letter from Social Security every year listing how much money Washington is going to send them for their Social Security check. So the seniors are not a theoretical projection. They walk amongst us. Their payment formulas are already set in law. The Washington and current law has already committed to send a certain amount of money to seniors over the next 30 to 40 years. So there's really not much uncertainty about this. We know that over the next 30 years, Social Security and Medicare are going to run a cash shortfall of $124 trillion, including interest costs. Let me repeat, $124 trillion shortfall. And that's because we know how many checks with how much money we're sending to what people.
Yeah, policy and demographics give the future. You can count these people, you know their age. Time is unbelievably predictable. I mean, I can
Hmm.
predict that Monday turns into Tuesday and 2024 turns into 2025. You can't stop that from happening. Yeah,
Right.
I've done a lot of study on 401ks when you have a policy that says we're going to have to take mandatory withdrawals in their 70s. And you can see that these laws force things to happen, and it
Yeah.
does bring a degree of predictability. Well, I'm very much political. Manhattan Institute's a conservative, but you have Brookings Institute. You have a lot of bipartisan institutions. David Walker, who a lot of people don't know who he is, or he still or was, but he was the Comptroller General of the United States, head of the GAO, and he kind of quit his job in frustration because he worked under both Democratic and Republican administrations for many years. And he kind of threw up his hands and said, look, the biggest threat to national security is not something hiding in a cave in Afghanistan. The biggest threat to our nation's security is the fiscal irresponsibility of
Hmm.
promised money. And I'd like to break this down a little bit, not to be too wordy with it. But there's two types of money you might think about if you're listening in a liability column. The first kind of liability you might refer to as borrowed money that's been funded. If the Treasury says we need cash, they can have an auction and they can issue bonds. That money is brought in, it's funded, and they can allocate that money through
Hmm.
House Ways and Means and Appropriations. Committees can fight about those. Um, there's another part of liabilities that people don't often see, which is unfunded. And you referred to this a little bit earlier. We know that we have about $34 trillion that's been borrowed already, and that's the number most people are familiar with. But the money that's been promised through policy,
Yeah.
this 124 trillion for Social Security and Medicare, but if you add to that pensions, you add to that money that has not been raised or borrowed yet, there's some that say it approaches in the 200 trillions, and it can be higher than that if inflation goes up. And I think one of the things that was really cool about your report is, and this was really really insightful, is people don't have an appreciation for when the Fed has to raise rates in order to curb inflation and what that does when the next round of bonds is up, say, a percentage. And you made a reference to, you jack that up 1%, and it's the equivalent of having another Department of Defense level expense. Could you expound on that
Sure.
fluctuation of the Fed? Is if they have to be hawkish to fight inflation,
Hmm.
and they have to raise that interest rate, what does that do to our commitments to these people in the future?
Well, first, I just want to mention that you mentioned Brookings and David Walker. It's funny, about 12 years ago, me, David Walker, and Brookings did a national speaking tour on these issues together. It was
Really?
called the Fiscal Wake Up Tour. We hit about 100 different
Yes.
cities nationwide. And the idea was you have the right, the left, and the comptroller general all agreeing on the numbers. This stuff is not partisan. So it's funny, you brought up Walker, Brookings, all of us. The interest costs are really a ticking time bomb. Essentially, the federal government has gambled the entire economic and fiscal future on the assumption that interest rates will never, ever exceed 3% ever again. Because if
Yeah.
they do, we can't afford it. And the Congressional Budget Office, in their projections, assumes the interest rate on government bonds never exceeds 3.8% at any point ever again in the future of America. Now, the 10-year bond's at 3.8 today. If they're wrong, and interest rates tend to fluctuate, what you said is correct. Every point interest rate rises adds $30 trillion in interest costs over 30 years, which is like adding another defense department. So if interest rates rise instead of 3.8, they're 5.8 over a couple decades, you got to add $60 trillion to the debt just to pay the interest on this. This is the danger of borrowing close to 150, 200 trillion dollars, especially when you mention the other liabilities. When you owe that much money, even small increases in interest rates will completely devour you. So then you create a situation where the Fed has to keep interest rates low, artificially low, in order to prevent a debt crisis, which only gives us inflation.
It is fascinating to think about how these things weave into the fundamentals on a sovereign level, a global
Mhm.
level, but even corporate level. And the Fed is in a rough spot because the Fed, they've got one hand trying to keep price stability in one mandate. They've got another hand trying to keep jobs and stability in the job
Mhm.
market is another mandate. And those are often opposing goals with how they tweak their policy. And I thought it was really interesting when Silicon Valley Bank failed, because
Mhm.
what happened is these banks, they have deposits, and those are liabilities on their side. It's the I put money in, that's my asset, but it's the bank's liability. They got to pay interest. So these banks and even money markets, they've got to find places to park cash to have it earn money. And one of those places is bonds, is treasuries. And
Mhm.
so Silicon Valley Bank has all these treasuries that are at 0%. I mean, they're paying hardly anything at all. And then all of a sudden we have inflation, and the Fed jacks up these rates. And by the way, we've come down on the bonds. We had higher interest rates than
Mhm.
3.5%. And when that happened, people got together and said, well, let's go get our money from Silicon Valley Bank. And they were forced to sell these bonds, which are their value is inverse to interest rates. Interest rates go up, the old bonds go down in value,
Mhm.
and it caused a bankruptcy just out of Fed policy. It was interesting. That happens on a Friday. Over the weekend, they fix it for everyone else except Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
It was too late for them. And I think about your projections, Brian. When you say that they're not going to believe that there's going to be bonds higher than 3.5%. Well, that's like Kentucky and their school administrators that bought into pension programs that were supposed to yield 8 and didn't.
Mhm.
And so when you make a prediction that it's going to yield 8 on your side or never more than 3.5 on the other side, you can't do that because we can't predict that. So
And-
that's interesting that you went around with David Walker. He's one of my heroes. But just
yeah.
comment maybe a little further on that, on the unpredictability of interest rate.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I liken it a lot to the housing crash, where people were buying houses on the assumption that housing values would keep rising at a rapid rate. And when they didn't, these people lost their shirts. And on interest rates, the amazing thing is, and I was screaming this 5 years ago, Washington never locked in low interest rates on the debt. Even when the 30-year bond was trading at 2% 4 or 5 years ago, we were still acting like a subprime borrower buying short-term adjustable mortgages or short-term bonds that roll
Yeah.
over in 12 months. And I was going, why aren't we locking in the low rates?
Yeah.
Because if interest rates ever
Interesting.
go up in the future, we're going to be buried. And the response I got was, well, they're 2% now, but what if they go to 1%? We can wait until then. So they didn't
Incredible.
lock in the bonds. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, there's no backup plan on interest rates. And one thing we can say about interest rates is that most people have been wrong about interest rates forever. There was a 30-year decline in interest rates between 1990 and 2010 that almost nobody predicted. Um, the spike in interest rates a couple of years ago was predicted by almost nobody. And in the future, whenever markets go, even markets don't predict interest rates very well. And so one thing we can say is, I don't know what interest rates are going to be in 20 or 30 years, but I can say they're probably going to fluctuate. And they're probably not going to stay at a low level for 30 straight years. And in fact, I can make a case that interest rates will have a lot of factors pushing them upwards. But it's just very dangerous to base your entire economic and fiscal structure for decades on any sort of promise, like as long as interest rates never hit 4% ever again, we're okay. That's usually the famous last words before the crash comes.
So we have a leadership deficit in our nation. I don't like to get political. I'm very much politically neutral in my life. Pretty much no one likes me because I don't agree with everything the left has to say, and I don't agree with everything the right has to say, so nobody likes me. I
I know, but I relate.
Yeah, I tend to be a little bit, socially liberal. I mean, let people do what the hell they want. If they want to, if someone has cancer and a little cannabis will help them, let them do it. But on the other side of it, when it comes to the fiscal, that's it. Like I don't see either side of the aisle wanting to address this elephant in the room. Neither side wants to talk about it because solutions for this are painful, and that's leadership. For example, when I'm coaching basketball and we're in a practice, there's kind of a no pain, no gain deal where it's like, guys,
Mhm.
if we want to win, we're going to have to do some things and push our bodies in a certain way that's going to make us uncomfortable now in the chance to win a championship later. And if we fail to put our bodies through this pain today, we're not going to have the muscle to win tomorrow. And really there's three real things you can do. You can cut spending, you can raise taxes, and you can grow the economy. And those are really, from a broad perspective, there's three ways. We have a gross domestic product. That's where we get taxes. So if you can grow that pie, you can be like Bill Clinton and you have this internet boom. Next thing you know, you got a balanced budget because there's so much corporate tax coming in. And he's happy to take credit for that. But now this is way like you have a $2 trillion. We're over the next 10 years. What is our deficit? 12 trillion, something
Well,
like
it's gonna,
that
I mean,
over the next 10 years.
it's going to 20 or 25 trillion. The annual deficit's going to 4
You
trillion, but even
can't
before
keep
interest
up
rates
with it.
rise.
Can't even
Yeah,
keep
yeah.
up with it.
And ultimately, I used to work in Congress and I work with Congress all the time. I testify before Congress. I brief members. I give speeches to the Republican conference, usually, sometimes a Democratic conference. They all know this.
Yeah.
They all know that the numbers are unsustainable. They all know we're heading for a crash, and they don't care. I mean,
Well,
what
now,
they will tell
now,
me point blank that, look, we know this is going to happen, but if I say a word about it, I'm going to lose my seat. So I am not going to do it.
because they
They're
want
very
votes.
they say the voters don't want to solve this, so I am not going to. And I think of the President Biden's State of the Union a year and a half ago when he stood up and said, we will not touch Social Security or Medicare by one penny, but Republicans want to. And Republicans booed. And Biden said, oh, so you won't touch it either. And Republicans cheered. And then they all said, when we're not going to raise taxes either. And you had both parties cheering essentially a path to a debt crisis. And I know it sounds mean to say the members don't care, but it's kind of amazing to be in these briefings and you lay out all the charts and all the numbers and all the data and all the scenarios, and they raise their hand and say, I'm going to cut taxes even more and I'm going to raise spending even more because that's what my voters want.
When we come back from this quick break, I'm going to talk about some of the solutions you propose. You talk about how unrealistic a balanced budget would be in the short term, but you talk about getting a debt to GDP ratio that's somewhat stable. So we'll talk about that when we come back from this break. Make sure that you stay tuned because when we come back, we're going to talk about solutions, and I'm going to throw some curveballs at Brian and see if he can knock those out of the park for us. We'll be back in just a bit.
Responsive to questions, they're very detailed in their training. You can start from no investing experience whatsoever and get educated and be able to make a nice retirement for yourself or even a living. It's an amazing educational system, and I would highly recommend it. The one thing that will get you more confident in investing is your education, your competency, and if you can get to that point, you can do anything.
Welcome back to the Cash Flow Academy podcast. Very important discussion. I'm here with Brian Riedl, and we are speaking about his report from the Manhattan Institute recently. It's a fantastic report in the last couple of months that's come out. You say that people in Congress know this. Does Bernie Sanders know it? Does Stephanie Kelton know it? Because Stephanie Kelton wrote a book called The Deficit Myth, and her buddy Warren Mosler says that, hey, we can print all the money we need, and as long as we can collect taxes, the dollar's going to have value. If we don't take Bitcoin, and we don't take rubles, and we don't take feathers, and we don't take gold coins, as long as we only take dollars, value of the dollar is going to be fine. What do you say to the MMT guys and how much they're not smoking marijuana, they're snorting coke, I think. But what's your take on those guys? I'll give you a chance to rant with me on that for a minute.
The way to look at MMT is they started out, it's a lot of progressives wanted to spend money without limit. That's where they're going. They want to spend money without limit and without consequence. So they backfilled an economic theory that said we could just run the printing press forever to fund every bit of our dreams, and we'll just pretend that inflation doesn't exist. We'll just run the printing press forever and pretend there's no such thing as inflation. It's such a joke that you can't find real economists who endorse it. I mean, University of Chicago does these economic polls. It gets 0%. It's really an absurdity. And in fact, the thing about MMT2 is it doesn't even have a coherent model or theory. It's essentially blog posts by gurus who can change their mind every 5 minutes on how it works to fit the day's events. There's no model, there's no testable theory, which is why MMT has received no publications in any academic journals. It has not received anything in a peer-reviewed journal because they can't formalize it. It's guru based with a bunch of random guru economists. It's just not serious.
It's not. Now, here's an interesting question I have for you. Is you go out with David Walker and you go on this tour, and you're trying to educate the electorate because the politicians won't talk about it. And most of the electorate, I mean, what are we even freaking talking about right now in the campaigns? I mean, to me, this should be front and center. I think it's the most, it's bigger than global warming. It's bigger than whether people are men or women or whatever they want to talk about. Look, if you don't have any food, that's a big deal. So we have all these promises. You mentioned in the report that, there's a lot of wealth in the elderly. There's a lot of wealth there. And that's a place that probably going to get cut. And that's going to be way politically unviable for the, I put into this is my money and I expect to get out. That's the mentality and the myth they see. Doesn't work that way at all. It's shifted to a younger generation paying for an older one. And we're crushing the kids. I think one of the reasons you want to talk about morality and all these social issues of morality and whether you have guns or not or whether you have an abortion, fine. But I'll tell you, when a child is born in the United States, to saddle that with taxes or debt, either one, to me, it's unconscionable. So we have this moral idea, no one's touching it. Would you comment on that quickly? And then I have two more questions.
Absolutely. I mean, this is the biggest intergenerational transfer of wealth in world history. And it's really hard to justify because, look, no one wants seniors to go hungry. Nobody wants seniors to go without medical care. But the reality is today's seniors are the wealthiest generation and the wealthiest age group in the wealthiest country. Senior income over the past 40 years has grown 4 times as fast as the income of the workers paying their taxes. So Social Security and Medicare today largely redistribute income upward. There are millions and millions of seniors who are multimillionaires, even outside the value of their homes, who are still getting huge Social Security and Medicare subsidies. I can defend Social Security and Medicare for low-income seniors. I don't know why we're taxing waitresses and welders so that the richest seniors can come out way ahead. And when I say come out ahead, I mean the typical retiring couple today is going to get back triple what they paid into Medicare. So my question is, if we're going to pay all Social Security and Medicare benefits without any reforms, we're going to have to double middle class taxes. Why would we double middle class taxes so that the richest multi-millionaire seniors can get back triple what they paid into Medicare and come out way ahead in Social Security? That's not social insurance. That's just upward welfare to the richest people beyond what they earned.
It's an amazing thing to think about, the elderly on one side above me in age and the kids I have on the underside. And I look at where both of them are and I fear for my children. So let's shift this a little bit. I absolutely would. I'm like the biggest David Walker fan ever. I mean, they did I think it was either 2020 or 60 Minutes that did a piece on you guys going out on this tour. And I
60
think
minutes.
I think I replayed that 60 Minutes pretty much every speech I've given in the last who knows how long. I mean, I really, really tried to get people to listen. And I just really fell in love with David because I could feel sincerity and he cared about his grandkids. However, I think I wouldn't ever call it a fool's errand, but one of the things I get in disagreements with people in Washington is I think, like, I'll give you an example. I was talking about 401ks with Teresa Ghilarducci, who she's kind of a left-leaning professor who talks about the retirement crisis, and she says we got to get a systemic solution. My personal opinion is that ship has sailed so long ago. My appeal is not a systemic solution because I don't think I see no evidence of political will until it's too late and until the whole thing is sailed. I just don't think it's going to get the attention. If it's a crisis, we certainly don't have a crisis attitude towards it. And my thing is this: what can people do individually? That's going to be my mission. Is I'm kind of done with Congress on both sides of the aisle saying, look, you guys, we've been talking and talking and talking and talking, and we're in dire freaking straits. And no one is bringing this up in a debate. No one is bringing this up because both sides have blood on their hands. Both sides now have become spenders. They just fight. They don't fight whether to spend or not. They fight on appropriations, right? That's what they fight over. So do you think that, I mean, do you have any agreement with what I've said? Is this now to the point where it's like, look, a systemic solution is not going to happen. And this is going to be brought to bear. And it is now up to guys like me to defend my freaking family as an individual and prepare myself, educate myself to weather an incredible, unprecedented financial storm with fiscal and monetary policy being the blizzard coming together.
Yeah, I mean, I've been working on this issue. I've been speaking on and writing on this issue for 25 years, nationwide speeches, op-eds, working in Congress, working presidential candidates. We've made no progress. Like, the
None.
public doesn't care. And in fact, I mean, and ultimately, the public is to blame here. The reason politicians pander like Santa Claus is because that's what we want. We want more tax cuts and we want more spending. And we also lie to ourselves because we tell ourselves, well, actually, the deficit can be solved with one cool trick that just hits the other side. If we just tax the rich, if we just get rid of welfare spending, if we just get rid of foreign aid, if we just cut defense, if we just cut waste, everybody has their one cool trick. Just raise the cap on Social Security taxes. Let me tell you, you can do all of those. It doesn't come close. But everybody has their one cool trick that, oh, by the way, only hurts the other party. You need voters to kind of realize everything has to be on the table. Your taxes are going to rise and your benefits are going to fall, at least to some degree. And we're going to stop demanding politicians be Santa Claus and stop looking for the one cool trick and communicate that to political leaders that we won't murder you if you try to address this issue. Because again, the people I talk to in Congress, a lot of them actually would like to address the issue, but they
They
say
can't.
we can't. I mean, Paul Ryan tried to address this issue, and the other side ran TV ads of him murdering a senior citizen. And today, Paul Ryan's despised as much by the right as by the left because he tried to actually fix the problem. So ultimately, we have met the enemy, and it is us.
Boy, that's well said. The politics of today that bother me the most is how they frame it as if success in life comes through your vote. In other words, I'm kind of an old man, I guess, that I believe when I get up in the morning that my success is my job, that
Right.
I'm going to buy my own assets, that I'm going to get my own education. It's my job to make something of myself and produce value to the community. But it seems now that the political atmosphere is, look, if you vote for me, look, it's the government's job to take care of you. It's government's responsibility to have prosperity. It's the government's burden to make sure everything is happy, that everything is equal and everything is wonderful. And we're the side of government you should vote for. So your vote is what will help you be successful. And I just couldn't disagree with that philosophy on both sides of the aisle more. That I wish they would just get out of the way and quit promising everybody everything. Promises are so easy to make, and they're never held accountable. And we've inherited, my generation, the kind of the quieter generation, the Generation X, we have inherited this incredible freaking mess. And our choice is, we're either going to have to take this thing on the chin, or we're going to have to pass it down to our kids. And I don't think anyone's going to take it on the chin. I think our kids are, I think the smartest thing you do right now is teach your kid how to be individually protected, individually sovereign, individually wealthy, because I don't see a systemic solution. Would you comment on that? What are you doing with what do you do with your circle of friends, your family members? You've talked about this for 20 years. What are you telling them?
I tell them to save your money. I tell them to build your own retirement, save your money, build your savings, and don't assume that everything is going to be there in 20 or 30 years, because frankly, the government has promised more benefits than the entire economy and tax code would ever be able to deliver. And so you have to make sure that you are not overly dependent on, oh, the government's going to pay for my retirement, government's going to pay on their health care. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. And I would add that, as much as we're concerned about this being dumped on the next generation, I think it's going to be sooner than that. With where the debt is going right now, it's 100% of GDP right now. It's going anywhere from 230 to 300% of GDP over the next couple decades, depending on interest rates, just to keep current policies. This could be more of in the next 10 or 15 years that there's a crash, or significant fiscal consolidations. It really depends on when the financial markets finally say we can't fund this. But I mean, this may happen. If you're retiring today at 65 or 66, this may happen and hit while you're still collecting Social Security and Medicare. And so I think that the time frame is unfortunately moving up on us. And it angers me because for the last 20 or 30 years, we could have gradually phased in reforms while the boomers were young and Gen X was younger and could have easily adjusted. And instead, we're going to wait until there's a crash and then have to do bigger and more drastic and more painful reforms to people who are too old to handle it. And it's all because we didn't care until the house collapsed.
We don't have any strength. It's a weakness deal. Home of the free, land of the free, and home of the what? Home of the what? Home of the frickin' brave? Are we?
Mm-hmm.
Are we willing to go to basketball practice and sweat and build muscle and sacrifice now for the later? I sound like my dad. I sound like an old man now. Brian, I thank you from the bottom of my heart for this patriotic effort, this bipartisan effort. I've never had the chance to meet David Walker. If you ever see him in your circles, tell him there's at least one guy that was listening.
I will.
I will.
I just saw him a week ago, so I'll
really do that. He is
know.
absolutely one of my heroes. To pack up his office in boxes and go out on the road and do what he did for his grandchildren and mine. absolutely freaking heroic. I wish people would listen, so I'm grateful for this. We're going to put a link to this report in there. This is all data. This is not up for debate. These are facts. These are not maybe if. This is the course we are on. And so I would say that to be educated financially, I'm an education advocate, not an advice advocate. I would agree. The smarter you are with money over the next 10 years, knowledge will be life. Knowledge will be life. Knowing how to position and strengthen your own financial statement when everything around you is melting down. The good news, I'll say this, just go study how off-balance sheet promises work with companies like the Studebaker Company in the 60s. They saw it coming a million miles away. Go and look at San Bernardino and Stockton, California, and Detroit at the municipal level. Go and look at CalPERS in California, Illinois, and Kentucky in their teacher pension funds, and you can see how promised money is flawed. The only reason the United States can get away with this, they can print for a while. They can print for a while, but they can't print forever. And so I loved what you said, Brian, about, hey, don't just think because it's been promised that it's going to be there. You got to have an insurance policy, and you have to have what's called a knowledge of counterparty risk, is when the other party doesn't keep their promises. Last words to our listeners. You've been gracious with your time. I know you got to run. Last words of counsel, and I'll give you one more platform to do your thing.
Yeah, I guess my platform is try to be an engaged voter on this stuff and stop looking at politicians through the lens of what free lunch can you give me, and more in the view of stewardship and how can we right this ship and make the budget sustainable long term.
It's trillions and trillions of dollars. It's something that neither party wants to address. I hope people will study it. Hang on just for a minute after I close the show so I can properly thank you. Go to yourinvestingclass.com to learn more. We'll put a link to Brian's report. Check it out and read it as a couple, and it'll help you make some decisions for yourself. Till then, get smart, get invested, and be smart. We'll see you next time.